Part 15. Fuck you, Maeda. Oh god, where do I even begin? Well, I gotta start somewhere, so I'm gonna start with this point, about deception. Let's talk about Awakening and Fates. So it's pretty much an accepted truth that Fates' story leaves a lot to be desired. And I mean a lot. Many people felt really let down by it, but why was that? Those same people thought Awakening's story was bad too, so why were their expectations so high? Well, you see, ever since Fates was first announced, Nintendo was making a pretty big deal out of the fact that they scored a famous writer to work on the story. It's practically the first thing they say about it after the very first trailer, and that wasn't even half of it. Many of the pre-release interviews and articles are also focused on hyping up the story. However, I've chosen to focus on this specific interview. I feel it really encapsulates what I'm going to talk about, so I highly recommend you click the link and read it in full yourself before going further. But I know you're not going to do that, so whatever, I'll show some highlights. I present you Exhibit A. Iwata asks, Fire Emblem Fates. Iwata-san, I'm so sorry you had to be in this review. So to begin with, they start talking about why they felt the need to bring a famous writer on board to work on the story. And they pretty much openly admit that Awakening's story was received very poorly, hence the need to get someone with more clout involved. Just listen to these quotes.
Start with how the story was bad. The storyline for Awakening got criticized. Some people weren't satisfied with the storyline. But some people said they wish we had gone a step further with the storyline. The story felt lacking. They wanted a deeper and more complex storyline to make the next storyline one that everyone would be satisfied with.
Okay, I get it. Can't get much clearer than that. Even this guy and his daughter don't think much of Awakening's story.
I did feel that some parts were a little bit unsatisfying. She said, but the story is kind of cliché, so you think you could make it even better.
With this in mind, it's not hard to see why people's hopes might start to get raised. It seems like the people at the top are listening to and agreeing with the concerns raised by long-standing fans. It makes it seem like the developers really understand. And this Kibiyashi guy they got? Man, they really want you to know he is a big fucking deal. He basically runs off half his resume in his introduction. Iwata makes it out like he's always super busy because he's in high demand. Maeda literally describes him as a god, and everyone else is like, he's super famous. Even more promising. Then Kibiyashi starts talking about how much effort he poured into the manuscript.
And they told me I only needed to write 10 pages for each of the 3 storylines. Right, since he's so busy, I thought we could ask him to write about 10 pages for a plot summary. So I thought, well, I could do that. Then I started writing the story about the Hoshido family. I ended up using 10 pages on just the beginning. I ended up writing about 500 pages. As I write the details, like the characters' lines, I start to love the characters, and then they take a life of their own, and the story begins to move on its own. So there was no way I could write a short plot summary and be done with it. I thought, I really am an idiot, but I kept going. I ended up writing so much that it could have been turned into 2 books. If it wasn't good, my daughter would be angry, and while I was writing, she kept asking, how's it going? Which made me feel like, I need to make this good. So it kept getting longer, and it became a really elaborate story. And for a writer, thinking, this is going to be good is so much fun. Of course, you're stuck sitting, sometimes working all night, which is hard. But if you're enjoying what you're writing, the words just fly off the pen, and that ups the page count. So I ended up writing a lot, but looking back, I realized it was because I got so deep into the world of the story.
So not only is this guy a great writer, he really got invested in this project. But wait, there's more. He's also a fucking genius, and understood exactly how to write a plot that would work brilliantly in the Fire Emblem format.
There are several restrictions that you need to do when it comes to turning a story into a game. For example, in the Fire Emblem series, each chapter you go to a different map and have a battle. Right, although Kibiyashi-san had never been so extensively involved in the making of video games before, he considered all those conventions when he wrote the story. He didn't just write a lot, he wrote with an understanding of the conventions of Fire Emblem. That's right, I was very grateful for that. And since I played Awakening, I was able to get a clear picture of the pacing of the Fire Emblem series. So when I started thinking of the story, I could feel the story moving within the game, and I knew, this is going to be good.
Then they go into more detail about the story. Kibiyashi keeps gushing on about how awesome it is, and everyone else is just backing him up.
Kibiyashi-san, what did you choose to focus on when you wrote the story? I really wanted to make sure that it would make the players cry. It was really easy to add in elements that would make people cry, or things that would be really touching. Of course, it's all a betrayal.
Betrayal! What? Betrayal!
That's true, because the side you didn't choose becomes your enemy. And that means that the enemy's words cut really deeply. They really do. Like, you betrayed us. Right, the story is full of betrayal and the unexpected, so I want them to play through until the end, and I will be really happy if they played through several times. The deeper you dig, the more you will find, and there are parts that you come to realize were foreshadowing. I played through it several times during development, but there's so much depth to the story that no matter how many times you play, you don't get bored. I'm really looking forward to the release, and I actually want to play through it from the beginning again once it's released. It is totally the best story. You've never seen a story like this before, folks.
But as we all know, all of that is total bullshit. Everything in this fucking interview is bullshit.
At first, I thought that Country A and Country B would be depicted as opposites, but that wasn't the case.
Bullshit.
Even though you thought you were siding with evil, it wasn't actually all evil.
Bullshit.
But in the end, we didn't recycle much of anything.
Bull fucking shit.
Right, and we couldn't recycle any of the scenario.
Bullshit. It's all fucking bullshit. So much straight up lying. The whole point of this interview was basically to trick people into thinking that this game was going to have a really awesome and really deep story. You know what else they don't tell you in this interview? That they cut this guy's 500-page manuscript into tiny pieces, fed it to a male cow, then collected the resulting feces and molded it into the final product. Now let me make this perfectly clear, I'm not trying to shit on Kobayashi here. I respect his enthusiasm. As someone who's had to do a shit ton of writing himself, I understand getting really attached to your own work. And for all I know, he doesn't really know what they did to his script. I mean, he comes out after the release, kind of distancing himself from the final product with a tweet. Now some might say he's just being modest because of all the comments he got on Twitter. And he's just trying to give proper credit to the people who edited his script. Does a tweet like this really mean he's trying to distance himself from a horrendous pile of dung that is the final version of Fire Emblem Fates? I'll leave that up to you. But the answer is yes. So what, I hear you say? Just cause they acted like total sleazeballs about this game doesn't mean FE7 was affected. That game was made 10 years before. But there's one more piece to add to this puzzle, and it's this asshole. Kohei Maeda joined Intelligent Systems as a writer after Kaga left. However, he generally took assistant roles, as opposed to main ones. He began to take on a directional role, beginning with New Mystery, and continuing on with Awakening, Fates, and Heroes. But then what's this got to do with FE7? Well, you see, Maeda was the main scenario writer for FE7, and a lot of elements of and problems with this game's story are prominent in entries he went on to direct. The first one is pretty obvious, the Avatar. Mark might not be directly controllable as a unit like Chris, Robin, and Corrin are, and he doesn't have as much customization going on, but he's still essentially a self-insert character. Characters turn to face you and look directly at you through the screen while they're talking to you, and the tutorial even directly states this. Your strategic capability as a player is also connected to how Mark is described in the rankings, although the amount of praise you get is significantly less ridiculous than later titles. Narratively, sure, Mark's involvement in the plot is pretty light, and you can even play through Eliwood or Hector mode without him there at all. But you can't deny, he's the first and only instance of an Avatar in Fire Emblem when it came out, and the next one we get just so happens to come back when Maeda started directing. The next one isn't as obvious, because he doesn't want you to notice. Maeda's stories tend to have a really haphazard pacing, where they're constantly jumping from moment to moment. This ensures that you don't have enough time to really think about or process information being fed to you. I've covered plenty of examples of it in this game, but there's things like how threadbare the entire Valm plot of Awakening is, or that bizarre ass sequence where somehow Basilio was somehow alive, and Robin, who's supposed to be you, did some shit in secret to execute some grand plan that fooled everybody and stopped Grima from being summoned, because the orbs in the Fire Emblem were fake, except then somehow Grima ends up getting summoned anyway, and then the plot just moves on and nobody says anything. And Fates, moment to moment, is basically the entire story in a nutshell. I don't even want to have to start on it. Maeda seems to have a negative interest in plot coherence in general. He only seems to be really concerned with the big dramatic scenes that are meant to have an emotional impact, and he doesn't really care how he gets there, or how to actually resolve these moments. Things just happen, and then it's time to move on. This kind of approach to writing strikes me as really juvenile. It's like the equivalent of a kid who just wants to fast forward through the cool bits in a movie. Some other common threads include some suspiciously familiar story elements, like how the Avatar characters are waking up when the story starts, or the weird excuse assassins that seem to just take the worst elements of the Black Fang and characters like Jafar and ramp them up to 11. Speaking of the characters, it's on record in that last interview that Maeda really wants you to love the characters. And while it's true that Kaga also wanted the players to feel some kind of investment in their units, Maeda's personal approach to this seems significantly more skewed towards getting players attached to the characters, which sounds the same, but it's really not. Like, listen to this.
Maeda will do anything to make the characters more likable. He always tries to put in everything that will make the players love the characters even more.
So if I were a crude man, which I am, I'd put it like this. Kaga's approach is about creating tension in the atmosphere whilst you're choosing what to do. It's about invoking drama through the sense of life and death, and the pain of failure and the sweet taste of victory. It was about gamifying the nature of war in a classical epic like the Iliad, and there are tons of influences from that poem in early Fire Emblem, but I don't really have the time to go over them. The point is, it's a big part of the tone of the earlier games. Comparatively, look at what Maeda's games introduce. Stuff like casual mode is essentially about removing that tension and drama, and to make up for this loss, the focus is instead shifted to making you feel strongly attached to the characters you're using at all times, regardless of tension. So instead, you have these expanded customization systems and extremely prominent character traits that cover every sort of anime stereotype imaginable, and all sorts of weird fanservice stuff. Like the part where you're literally marrying characters in the game as they confess to you and shit. Honestly, you can sort of vaguely see the hints of that in FE7 too. Lyn has this kind of hinted at romantic interest in Mark, and that scene at the end of Lyn mode is almost like a proto-confession moment. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Maeda's characters and his games at large kind of play to what a fan would want, instead of trying to work to convey some large ideas. This makes sense. Maeda joined the team at IS as a fan. His perspective has always been that of a fan, so he writes like a fanfiction writer, and views the games as a way for people to have fun, rather than a way for him, as a director, to communicate with an audience. And ultimately, FE7 is when the first symptoms of Maedaitis start to become apparent. It's when you see characters start to become much more defined and entertaining. And I need to stress, I am not condemning this approach here. I don't really like it, but that's not the point. The point is that FE7 is, if you pardon the pun, emblematic of the future direction of the series, and has way too many things in common with the modern games to casually write off as coincidence. So when I see intelligent systems and Maeda blatantly lying like they did in that interview, it really makes it difficult for me to trust them. And that trust problem leaks back into FE7. I can't prove that Maeda had the intent to deceive us in FE7, but it becomes hard to just see things as incompetence when the same approach and ideas were being constantly refined, game after game, until we got where we are today. But whether you believe me or not, none of this makes FE7 worse as a game per se. It's still a badly written mess. The question of intentionality is an interesting one to think about though, and the things FE7 bears in common with modern Fire Emblem are important. I think it's something that isn't talked about enough. And I guess part of that is because no matter what, FE7 is still a much more reserved game than Awakening and Fates are. It's still more in tune with the older titles, and not so openly and off-puttingly interested in indulging the player's fantasies and preferences. It's kind of sad really. There was some potential there. Things could have been so different. A better villain with understandable motives that weren't hidden in extra chapters, multiple protagonists with different outlooks, and interlocking stories and arcs, a different sense of scale to encounters, and elements of mystery. If only Kaga could have made FE7. Oh.